Welcome to Plugged Inland. I'm Roger Bowman. On this episode, we're discussing immigrant and minority education and solutions that can and have been implemented to improve access and to improve outcomes. We see the expansion of our minority population in our region reflected in statistics, but also in our everyday experience, such as the increase in cultural cuisines in our local restaurants. Let's take a look.
You can see the growing number of ethnic groups in the inland area in these graphics. But you can also see the diversity of our communities and the wide variety of foods offered at area eateries.
Well, we're from Sombrerete, Zacatecas region of Mexico, and most of our recipes actually come from there. We have been in the family business for over 30 years now, so we would love for everybody to come out and try a little bit of Zacatecas. Our family recipes come from Sombrerete. My dad has actually brought those back with him from there, and he was a chef before, and now he's actually managing and owning restaurants. What makes our restaurant special is because it actually has recipes from Zacatecas, and not only is it just a Mexican restaurant, but it is also family owned and operated, so you will see the whole family here actually working together, and so it gives you more of that home feeling.
There's 1,000,001 chain restaurants that you can go to, but people come here day after day for exceptional food at affordable prices that's homemade, one pan at a time. It's made to order, it's made fresh with quality ingredients you can taste. I mean, you want to support local business and reap the benefits of fresh flavor and just honest to goodness, great food.
Coming to Casa Moreno, I think, distinguishes us from the rest because walking into our restaurant is like walking into our culture. You really get to have the feel of who we are and where we come from. From the moment you come into the restaurant, you are not only our guest, friends and family, but you are welcomed into our culture with our food, with our drinks, recipes that come from hundreds of years ago. And so it really distinguishes us from the rest, I think. You get to have fun in our culture, taste the delicious food that comes from our ancestors, and enjoy all the delicious foods and drinks that we prepare.
Wow, those made me hungry. I really thought they should have brought food for our guests and for everybody today, and we could all enjoy that and the libations. Yes. You know, to my mind, the best way to formulate successful strategies is to turn to researchers who study the issue. In our case, we're fortunate to have two researchers from the Claremont Graduate University, both of whom are associate professors of education, and both are representatives of a minority group. I'm pleased to welcome Susan Paik and Cecilia Rios-Aguilar to our studio. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for
So,
inviting.
one of you I understand is Latino and one is Korean. Which is which?
I think you can pretty much tell. If I speak a little bit and if you look at her,
I
you
am the
figure it out.
Latino. It's true.
You're the Latino, that's what I
Yes.
thought. That's,
Yes,
you know,
yes.
I had a bet down.
And I studied Japanese when I was young,
me
so
llamo
I have.
Susana.
No, I'm from
Yeah.
Mexico City originally, so I'm Latina.
So I'm just going to share with our audience, I expected two really boring, stilted researchers, and that's exactly what I got.
Oh,
No,
Thank you for the
show
compliment.
isn't done yet.
you're both great. It's been great talking to you before the show. I know our audience is going to enjoy it, so let's get to it.
sure.
You are first generation in America, is that right?
I am. I would say I'm actually 1.5.
1.5.
Yes, I was born in Korea, but I came here when I was a year old. I grew up in Chicago, and and then I moved out to California.
That'd be more like a 0.9, wouldn't it? Because you're not quite first generation.
Right. But I wouldn't say I'm completely second generation either, because I was born in Korea and I
Yeah.
can speak Korean. But the U.S. is my home.
So you're the first one in your family to go to college, is that right?
That's correct.
So how did that transpire? What provided you the opportunity?
I knew that education was going to provide opportunities for me. So I actually tried very hard to find resources. I paid for my own college. I was also the first to get a doctoral degree in my family. I knew that I needed to go to grad school. I needed college education. I needed to go to grad school to become a professor. So I had some ambition of what I wanted to do at an early age.
But to the layperson, that's expected. You're the noble minority.
Right. Sure. The
Really?
model.
Are you a model?
That's true. I am the model. No.
A term I was unfamiliar with, frankly, until you told me about it.
Right.
So explain that and explain how that isn't always the case.
Yes, the model minority is actually, it's a model minority stereotype is a myth in that everyone thinks that Asians are all the same. And they're typically clumped together in media, sometimes even in research. But I've done enough research to show the more you study these diverse groups, the more different they are. You have the South Asians, the Southeast Asians, the East Asians. They're all performing at different levels. Some are more successful than others. But the more I study them, culture, history, language, how they came, who came, they're very different. And so the model minority stereotype is actually derogatory in that it boxes this group, so it provides a stereotype and doesn't show the differences.
So you're saying that to say that, well, of course you got your PhD would demean the group and also demean the effort and work that you did to overcome challenges and to figure out how to be successful in our college system in America.
I worked very hard, but clearly there are differences in success economically, educationally, again, across all the diverse groups, East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians. But even within those groups, there is variation. Some reports say there are over 300 languages easily for different Asian languages. But even with census data, you have at least 15 or so groups here, but there's so many more groups. But the histories of who they are, how they came, they're all diverse.
So we've been talking about your personal background, but in fact, you also researched this area. In fact, you wrote the book
Sure.
about overcoming these challenges, which
Sure.
I happen to have a copy of.
Yes.
And this book is a book that was put together when you organized a conference to bring together people to talk about the different minorities and the challenges they have in achieving excellent educational outcomes and occupational.
Sure.
So tell us about the conference.
Yes, this was several years ago. It was an exciting venture. It was actually a joint project with a conference and a book. And my colleague, Herb Wahlberg, and I wanted to do something different. So we actually got funding from the U.S. Department of Education. And we decided to bring different groups together, the Latinos, the Blacks, and the Asians. And the reason why we wanted to do that was because there was no other conference or book like that out there. It was a unique conference. It was a very exciting project. It was a chance for us, 3 different groups, to come together. We got the funding, and so we flew out 75 experts out to Washington, D.C. Policymakers, practitioners, researchers, all studying Latino, Black, or Asian groups, and it was very exciting. And we came together to talk about not only the similarities, not only the differences, but similarities. People are always saying that they're so different, but we also talked about commonalities across the groups.
Yeah.
So that was a very exciting project.
Great. And I was flipping through the book. I didn't get a chance to read it all.
Sure.
But it is a lot of results with recommendations, and I kind of want to highlight some of those later on in the show. Cecilia,
Sure.
I want to talk to you for a little bit.
Thank you. By the way, I wasn't invited to that conference. I don't know why, but maybe they didn't pass me the memo on time.
Well, I didn't know her at the time, but she
Oh,
would have been on
okay.
my VIP list.
All right.
Sorry, I just had
Cecilia, we were talking about motivations to achieve in college, higher education. And I know there's a whole issue of K-12, but talking about college, you were telling me something that just surprised me as well, and that is that not everybody sees college as the path to success.
Yeah, we have, I think, a lot of examples out there of how people and messages, right? Currently, the Zuckerbergs, people in high-tech places, that they all have something in common. They dropped out of college. So we have been our youth in a lot of communities are receiving these messages from very powerful people, but also I think around them in their communities, around their friends, their circles, their social networks. They're evaluating, they're saying, that guy that went to college, my cousin, doesn't have a job right out of college. He studied, he spent all this money, and guess what? He doesn't have a job. And there's my godmother and her daughter who are struggling a lot. Who knows if my students who are graduating from grad school, who knows if they're gonna have a job? So people are very smart. Everyone is very smart and are trying to make these connections and say, will I have a chance to get a job? So it's not about motivation necessarily, it's about people being very smart in making decisions based on what they know and who they know. And unfortunately or luckily, it's still one of those debates whether there's this ideology of college for all. Is college for all?
Is that the right idea? Is that what we want to strive for?
I think what we want, in my opinion, is to give everyone at least the chance to be able to go to college. Now, we cannot force everyone, and people will make different choices, and that is fine. But at least we need to be able to help everyone get there, and then they can make the decision.
So what you've talked about a little bit, though, almost stunned me. I thought the problem really was, and I'm sure it is, access to college. But what you were talking about is this idea that, it's kind of an economic choice. They can see people that graduate that either aren't working or aren't working in their major and say, these other people, they went in the military right out of high school, or they went into a trade school, or they have a job, and they're making ends meet. They're supporting a family. They're doing okay. Maybe college isn't the right choice at all, whether it's accessible or not.
I don't know if like I said, it has so much to do also with the K through 12. You cannot separate it in that sense. A lot of students, like a lot of English language learners, these students that are also stereotyped, just as in the cases the minority myth, they're stereotyped for different reasons. But they're being put in programs that reduce just the content to grammatical features. Content is completely, content and relevance is completely disconnected from what's happening in the classroom. So some students are bored to another capacity, just the same my students probably are bored with whatever I say every week. But we have to understand that there is a preparation issue. So, and there are structural factors as well, like financial aid. It's a very complex process. It privileges certain forms of life that not a lot of people have. A lot of people were raised in single-parent homes. They have very difficult levels unemployment cycles. So these are very difficult conditions to live in. So we can't forget and neglect those. So it's a combination of things. But what we want is to help them prepare everyone, so that they can then make the choice, the right choice for them, which may be going to a trade. But right now, I think the job market has changed so much, and we keep focusing in education only on education success, instead of helping our kids and our youth and our returning adults understand what is it that they want to accomplish, what is the value of this education for them. Is it to get a job? Is it to get promotion? The case of community colleges is the most, they're full of these wonderful, talented people, but they want to do different things. So why are we trying to just measure success in a certain way?
Cecilia, I know that you are involved in programs that examine apps and social media and how to communicate some of those things amongst the group that's making those decisions. I want to get back to that. Susan, tell me about the differences between education in America and education in the rest of the world.
Well, I teach an international education course, and so we talk about everything from what's happening with the society to cultural differences to what's going on to the classroom. And if we look at different countries, we can really understand the U.S. even more just by comparison. But right now, the U.S. is doing slightly better, but all the national and international tests show that the U.S. actually starts to drop in middle school, then high school. And then you have the Asian and the European countries on top, still remaining by the end of high school. And there are a lot of differences for that, but everything from macro to micro level differences, classroom teaching, the way they teach, the way they work with the students, and the time factors. You have, for example, in East Asia, 220 days per year versus the U.S. is 180 days.
Hold on, so you're saying that ultimately my U.S. child, is taught for 180 days out of the school year, but in these other countries, they have 220 days
Correct.
Of education.
Yes, yes. And then some, because not only do they have longer school years, but they go to school after school. Very common for Asian countries, even for some of the European countries. But they will go to school on Saturdays as well. So constantly,
My kid does that. I mean, football practice,
Sure.
soccer, scrimmages.
Right.
But we're talking probably academics, not not so much
Right,
That
right.
academic part of it.
Right.
Yeah, nobody goes to school after school for academics.
So this is actually the norm in Asia, but they've also brought it here. The immigrants have actually extended that kind of thinking here. So if you go to Koreatown or some Chinese ethnic enclave, they have these programs actually that support more of the academic studies. But typically, though, they do focus on academic subjects. But I've done studies that showed that there was, looking at the end of high school, 50% difference in terms of school, how much time they spent in school. But also by school, inside and after school, 100%. But after school time alone, by the end of high school, would be 400% difference.
400%.
Yeah, and
Difference. In other words, in lay language, to recap, a U.S. student will have spent 1/4 of the time learning academics that these other students would have spent.
Correct. They are, again, going to school, but it's longer, and after school they're continually learning, so they're trying to get ahead. This is not remedial programs. They're all academic advanced enrichment programs. So they're spending that much more time, so it does make a difference.
Why do you think that that is not a systemic part of our society and our culture, generally?
That's a good question. I think that some of it's cultural. The East Asian countries base a lot of what they do on scholarship, so that's embedded in the fabric of their culture. Here, I think if we even tried to do that, we would have students rebelling, parents rebelling,
Professors and teachers.
Right, right. So I think even though it's a productive idea, it's one that is different, and you know, we do these comparative studies, but you can't wholesale something and put it somewhere. It works for the Asian communities because the immigrants are continuing what they're doing from their mother country. They've brought that over, so it's continuing. But if you wanted to try to implement this with American kids, I think it would be very hard.
So you mentioned East Asia. What countries does that entail?
Typically Japan, China, and Korea.
Okay. But amongst the Asian countries, you also have Southeast Asia. And what countries are those?
Southeast is Vietnam, Cambodia, Laotian, and Hmong. Those are the ones that census data accounts for, but there are many more. Those are the more ones that people know about.
Okay. And they too have after-school programs, excelling in academics, am I right?
Southeast Asian is very different, and that's a great question. These after-school programs are predominantly actually East Asian. Some of the South Asians continue. This is a very popular thing in South Asia, although it's not as popular here in the U.S. But it's not practiced across all Asian countries, which is very interesting, and it does make a significant difference.
You mentioned those countries, and most Americans will know those countries as the countries where people were displaced because of the Vietnam War. So are they recent immigrants?
Post-1975 immigrants. And the other Asian groups typically came at the 1965 immigration wave with the Hart-Celler Act. Those are the newest Asian refugee immigrants, and they're very different. They came here literally with the shirts on their back, war-torn. They're the ones right now who are struggling. The Vietnamese group, they actually have high achieving and low achieving in their group. But the other groups, the Cambodian, the Laotian, and the Hmong, a lot of people don't know about these groups because they're much smaller. They're not as visible. But they are the groups that are struggling that we have to support.
So this is another evidence that stereotype of, all Asians excel in academics. It really is foundational. I want to talk a little bit about why the East Asian countries succeed. You mentioned scholarships and you mentioned culture. But when we're talking about these other countries, the thing that they have in common generally is they came here without resources, and they are seeing the same challenges that everybody without resources in America has. There's no difference really between them just because they're Asian.
Right.
It's really a matter of resources and enabling that
Right.
allow one group to achieve that, and I think being able to overcome the nerd stigma, which I know is a problem for a lot of American kids.
Yeah. Again, as I had said earlier, these groups are so diverse. The more I study them, the more different they are. But if we really want to understand the groups, we want to look at the histories of their immigration. Who came, why did they come, how did they come? The Southeast Asian groups that are struggling right now, this group came with the least education and the least skills. Pretty much for many of them, they were farmers. They came from agricultural societies. So coming here to the U.S. was much of a culture shock to them. And they were displaced throughout different parts of the United States. Many of the other groups are in metropolitan areas. So they also had ethnic enclaves that they can find support in. These other groups actually didn't have that ethnic enclave support, so it was difficult for them. But it's like any immigrant group. You really want to understand them. You have to look at their histories, the immigration patterns. And then you can understand why they're high achieving or low achieving. And I think that's important. But even with the Latinos, it's Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, they're all very different. And they also get clumped together too.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that really each group has its own distinctive qualities.
And one of the points that I love that you're here to help us with is dissecting that, dividing it out, and realizing that it isn't about what your ethnicity is. You can't stereotype the group. You have to really say, what are their foundational conditions that lead to that success? And before I turn to Cecilia for you to parse, say, the Cuban and Chicano communities, we have a couple of tweets and emails. So first, Maria of San Bernardino, and I'm going to read it.
Yeah.
I'm in high school and really like it, but when I try for the AP classes, my counselor, who is also Mexican, so clearly Maria is, told me that because I'm a Mexican, I will fail and I shouldn't even try. Wow.
That's
Just work on getting out of high school is what she's told by the counselor. Fair?
it's completely horrible that she is experiencing this type of message. Unfortunately, a lot of our counselors, administrators, and even faculty members and researchers, we have this mentality that I call it the deficit mentality. That certain groups, these groups or that group, always lack something, or you're not going to make it. Instead of focusing on trying to help her get to those AP classes, don't listen to that counselor and go and get those AP courses, because you can succeed just like any human being can succeed in this country.
Yeah. And I just want to add that this is a common problem. And many times they get bad advice. So do your homework, be resourceful, get as much information as possible, talk to teachers, different counselors. But I think that it's important to address that.
Yeah, I agree. Let's go to another one. Question from Gretchen of Calamasa. What's the Asian student's incentive to put that much time into studies?
That's an excellent question.
My kids want to know.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, again, the societies, let's say East Asia and here, are very different, okay? It's hard for us to understand if we go into a classroom and say, okay, here are these students and these students. You really have to understand context. And so for East Asians, getting into certain schools, let's say, for example, like the Harvard in East Asia or whatever, that is harder to get there than it is here, because there's less institutions there.
Their version of Harvard, in other words, their top schools.
Yeah, their top schools.
It's extremely tough to get there.
It's so difficult, but that the students are really trying to work as hard, and the norm is everybody studying, so you can't be left out. Everybody's going over here, so you want to catch up to them as much as possible. So that is the norm. If you're not studying, that's abnormal, unfortunately. But the reason why it's important is because it's incentive-based. Yes. What I mean by that is they want to go to a school. What that means is they need certain scores. So they need to study as hard as they can, and they have to sacrifice. But once they get into that school and they can finish from that school, then they have their choices of jobs, life mates, social circles. So it's that hardcore.
There's a lot at stake.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then let me ask, in that situation where you have the equivalent of the Harvard in the native country,
Sure.
Are there also the equivalent of so many other universities at lower level that they can choose from? Or is it really only a few universities, they're very good, but if you don't get into those, you don't get anything?
They do have different kinds of universities, of course. But because they have less universities in general, the competition is that much more fierce. Everybody knows which are the best schools. And if you can get in there, then you have your choices. But in general, they have less institutions to choose from. Here, it's a little bit different because you have community colleges. So if you don't get into a school, you might go to community college for a year and get your grades up and transfer. And that's because there are more options here. There are less options in different countries.
So if there's less options, I would imagine then that you either get into the best universities, in which case, like you said, your life is kind of made, or if you don't, your life is going to be very uncertain and unstable possibly, and I may be oversimplifying, but that may be why you work so hard to get in. Because in America, I think the idea is, and I'm generalizing, but if I'm a student and I'm smart, I'm natively inherently smart, but I haven't excelled and I'm not getting into Harvard or Berkeley or Stanford, let's say, I believe I'm still going to do okay. I'm going to get into a college, or even if I don't, I'm going to get training in the military, or I'm going to get, a craft or a trade, and I'm going to do okay because I'm going to work hard. So it doesn't seem like it's as necessary or it's seen as necessary to get a good school.
You're saying in the United States?
I think so.
Yeah, again, there's so many options here. But if you take East Asia, where scholarship is so embedded in the fabric of their society, that degree, it actually means something, okay? Here, it's America. We have the Bill Gates and other people who haven't finished. But this is an entrepreneurial, creative country where they have those choices. The society, the culture is very different.
Cecilia, we were talking with Susan about the fact that even amongst the Asian community, there's different support and resource levels for different groups of Asians. And that's true also of the Latino community, isn't it?
Correct. There's a lot of diversity among Latinos. Unfortunately, a lot of people who are not from Mexico, a lot of students who are from Central America, and they look at them and say like, oh, you're Mexican. No, they're from El Salvador, from Honduras, from very, very different countries. So it's always good to remember there's so much variation and richness, and that's a really good thing. And we just need to, I think, get better at recognizing and validating this richness. Because I think kids and young people are struggling with their identity because they belong to this group, or right, you were talking before about the smart versus the no smart. But I think I want to point from you were providing a hypothetical example, and you were saying, well, what if this naturally able? I think that's part of what is the problem in education right now. That we're saying, well, this IQ test, and we keep going back to these ideas of who's smart and who's naturally or genetically smart. We're all smart. And I think that's where I want to come from with my research is we all are smart. It doesn't matter where you come from. So the thing that we as educators need to do is try to do the hard work in trying to identify what is it that you bring to the table and how can we use it to make education better. Not the opposite, not saying who's smart and who's not and whose group has better grades than the other. There's variation everywhere, in many, many different groups. I mean, there's always, Susan was talking about the Vietnamese, there's high achieving, there's Mexicans who won Nobel Prizes, there's Mexicans who can't finish middle school. There's always going to be variation.
Tell me about the Cuban population.
The Cuban population is a very peculiar case just because, as Susan said, you have to understand the history of how they came here. They came here with a very specific legal protection and status. They were received in a very specific community, which is mostly in Florida. Again, I don't want to stereotype, but I do not like stereotypes. But the history tells us that they came with a specific legal status, protection, and they in an enclave, economic enclave in Florida. And they were protected. They did not have to go through a lot of visa issues that we all have to go through as immigrants. Language probably was a barrier, but they were very highly educated, the first Cuban that they arrived. I recently read a study because I have got the opportunity to meet this very famous Cuban professor, Alejandro Portes, and his brother. They're both Cuban immigrants. One was raised in Cuba, the other was raised in Iowa, out of all places, and they're both full professors. One is at Princeton, the other is at the University of Georgia. Both Cuban, and Alejandro studies a lot immigration, and he said already 30 years later, the advantage that Cubans have, it's gone, because the immigration pattern has changed.
Okay, that is opposite of what I would have thought. In other words, I would have thought that the Cubans came here in the common perception that we see on television in these rafts that are sinking and the Coast Guard plucks them out of the water and they have nothing. Like you, Susan, were talking about the Cambodians and Laotians coming over with just the shirt on their back. I would have thought that's the case for the Cubans, and you were telling me no, they came over not just with the protections, but with more money
just even
and education.
Imagine the fact that you come with a possibility to work legally and to make money legally. That changes the whole story for a lot of immigrants that came from backgrounds that were very different, that are just trying to figure out that maybe their kids were brought and had undocumented status. It's very different to have refugee status than to have undocumented status.
So Cecilia, are you saying that the Cubans that were accorded the ability to work, did they generally have better outcomes? Were they more prosperous?
That's what the data
Yes.
shows, that because of the history, the resources they brought, they were highly educated already. Cuba has a very good education system, by the way, too. So let's not forget and not
Right.
give them credit for that. They have a very good education system, and that reflected in them doing really good here at school, even though they have the language still going on, because they're Spanish speakers, they're native Spanish speakers. So somehow they were able to translate automatically what they knew in Cuba to the school system here, and economically they were doing great. But that advantage has been disappearing in the last years because the demographics have changed. Now you get more recent immigrants, not the same educational backgrounds, so it changes a lot.
I want to talk about the language issue. You've touched on the idea of legally being able to work, being documented.
Yes.
I want to mention ELL in a moment. Susan, let me ask, amongst the various Asian communities that came over, did some have an advantage in English over others, would you say?
Definitely. The South Asians.
South Asians or which? We've covered
the
East and Southeast.
Sure. The Indians, the Bangladeshi, the Pakistani, and there's more. Those are the ones that
The largest, I guess.
census data has recorded. But they came with English ability.
Why? By virtue
because
of what?
They were colonized by the British so many years ago. So they could speak English. But also the Filipinos speak English because they were colonized by the United States. So they also have a very unique history. And the Japanese actually, the immigration stopped for them, okay? But the ones who were here, they're like 4th, 5th generations now. They've been here, one of the groups that have been here the longest, but they are also English speaking. So those 3 groups can navigate society easily. They can assimilate more easily. They can move into a suburb. They don't have to move directly into ethnic enclave, for example, like the Chinese or the Koreans, because they're more native speaking. So it's easier for them to assimilate within their own cultures. But it made a significant difference for them in terms of getting a job, getting just more easily received by society.
So, Cecilia, English, if somebody has come from a Latin country,
Like
and
me.
Yes,
I
like
still
you.
have a very nice pronunciation, yes, that people can notice.
They come from a Latin country and English is not their first language and they're still in K-12.
Yes.
What happens to them? Are they forced to learn in English, or does that put them at a disadvantage? Do we teach in Spanish natively?
It's a very good question. Language is one of those aspects that people forget how important it is since they're very young and they were brought here for however the medium was or for whatever reason. They came to this country and the parents go the first day to school to register the kids. They're asked several questions. It varies by state because these are state laws. They can decide how they are going to decide or differentiate English language learners versus fully proficient. There are so many labels too that it's kind of, right now we have long-term ELLs. I mean, there's a whole variety of labels that we're now using. But there's, in 3 states, I can give you the example. California, Arizona, and Massachusetts have English-only laws. That means not even if a teacher would like to speak Spanish to the children and teach them in Spanish, they are by law required not to use, and they are penalized to use Spanish or any other language. We talk about Latinos, but it is any other group. Like I said, I don't wanna talk just specifically. Is these Mexicans
Sure.
that need the help, or is this little group of Asians? It's
Yeah.
all students who came to this country and have some limitation in their English, just like I did. I still have problems with my English, and I conjugate wrong verbs. I still need help editing papers. I mean, it's something I'm gonna have the rest of my life, and guess what? It's fine. But you need the support system. I needed to be able to go to the editing. I needed to be able to go to this content. So what we're saying is, we are not saying these children should not learn English and should not be proficient in English. Every child living here should be English proficient. But it is how you learn English and why they have to penalize so much the use of your own first language.
Yeah, let me circle back to that a moment because we have an email. Whitney from Redlands said, which ethnic group is badmouthed the most when it comes to education, test scores, and attendance?
I would bet is Mexicans. One, because of the size of the group, which is significant. Because we have, I think, probably scored the lowest of, even if they disaggregate by the census categories, we score the lowest on a lot of aspects of education. It's changing, it's going to change. Yes, just because of the demographics, it's going to start changing. So we're going to have to rethink what these measures and test score mean, because it's going to start changing drastically.
Let me jump to another email. Question from Mary of Upland. Of the Asian and Latino cultures, which one, in your opinion, is generally more welcomed by American citizens?
I think Susan has always been more welcomed to this country.
Yeah, you know,
it's very difficult.
It's difficult to compare. Again, because of diverse Asian American groups. I mean, if some can come and speak English, they'll have an easier time assimilating. But I think both Latinos and Asians have had their share of discrimination and racism. And I think that's important. For the Asians, even though people have been here for 5 generations, they still have an Asian face, so they're still seen as the perpetual foreigner. And so, yeah, I think you're right. So, but a lot of the research that I've looked at, there is a lot of discrimination that has happened for the Asians, and just many policies against them. More policies against the Asians than any other group historically.
Really,
they
I think all of us in the news would think that it's like Arizona, kick people out.
A lot of the English challenges to the law with respect to language policies, a lot of them started because they were discriminating Chinese and Japanese Americans.
Right,
and it was only in these inter-ethnic alliances, in these legal cases, that we're able to challenge it, meaning uniting Mexicans with Japanese, with blacks, when there's these multi-ethnic alliances, because we all have the same similar issues. And Susan is completely right. They have had their fair share of discrimination. It tastes different, it looks different, but it exists. And I think that's what we cannot neglect.
But if you go back to the histories of each of the groups, definitely you can trace a lot of that. But I mean, just for example, like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, or the...
Tell us, you teased it. Tell us a little about it.
Okay, so Chinese were not allowed. If you're Chinese, you cannot come here. You won't have any rights. 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act. If you were the Filipinos, they counted literally 48, 49, 50, no more this year. So there were a lot of these policies. There are too many to share tonight, but the history for both groups, they've received a lot of prejudice and discrimination.
You were telling me there was a law that said Chinese that came over could only be male.
Yes, right. So a lot of the groups that were allowed to come were male because they wanted them to be workers here. Yeah. For example, the Chinese they actually worked on the railroad systems in San Francisco and such, or plantation workers. So they only wanted them to come for employment, but they did not allow wives or children to come. So so for years it was completely a bachelor society.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just stunning.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to exploit them as workers.
Right.
We're not going to let them have what we consider to be a normal life.
Right.
And now the argument is, they're taking American jobs. Well,
that's a hard argument. And then they were not allowed to intermarry here.
And I just want to say, I'm sorry I haven't gotten to all the callers and emailers right away. I've lost a couple. Don't drop your call. Give us just a minute, and I promise we'll get to you. So do call back or do go ahead and email, and I promise I'll get to it. So thank you. So this argument about wanting to, take for instance, teaching in the native language. I know that there are programs where you are taught in Spanish, but you're taught English. You were telling me, for instance, about how the focus is on learning English, which is a good goal, But in the meantime, we're not teaching STEM, we're not teaching
No, content.
science, we're not teaching physics, we're not teaching mathematics to them in their native language. And it's going to be, as much as we may want people to know English, we want them to be productive members of society,
setting them
contributors.
up even for failure, because they'll never catch up. If I have right now that's what the term long-term ELL, because they've been in the system classified as ELL for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. The Arizona law says that in 1 year they're going to become fully proficient in English. That's just an idea that is not even realistic. It's not based on research. It's not based on anything except an ideology that someone said in 1 year children have to be proficient in English. That's never going to happen.
I lived in Japan for 6 months. So during that, I immediately recognized I had these aspirations. Oh, I'll learn the language. Let's say I were pre-med. I went over and started in college, and it was taught only in native Japanese, and I was trying my best to catch up with the language. I would miss so much. I wouldn't be competitive as a student. There's no way.
Now imagine on top of the academic, that you're separating the grammatical features. We're so obsessed with teaching, which is fine. They need to learn how to speak English properly, and they need to be proficient, but also the academic proficiency that they need, but also the socialization. How are you going to get to know English if it's not socializing with your peers? How are you going to get that capacity to write, to read, to talk? It's not possible. So we're isolating them and telling them, you Latinos and ELLs, go to your Latinos, Asian ELL. So we're doing the same thing. We recognize the variety, but then we group them in these labels and categories, and we don't let them talk to each other, learn from each other.
Cecilia, I'm going to jump over to a call.
Yeah.
So I just
Sure.
Good.
we have Patricia from Anaheim. Patricia, you're on the air. What's your question?
Yes, I don't have a question. I'm a retired bilingual teacher. Okay.
Yes.
I was teaching in 1981 to children that were Spanish speaking, and I have a degree in Spanish, and I am a true bilingual teacher. And I had children from all over that spoke Spanish. So what I did was work on that, teaching them in Spanish and in English.
Well,
and we had Lau versus Nichols.
Exactly. That's a law that we need to protect. Exactly what you're saying.
And then in 1987, someone from, I think it was from Arizona, managed to get a law here in California, Prop 87, to stop the program.
Correct. Those are the same people that are still designing and paying and supporting for these laws that are English-only laws, that don't allow teachers like you to use your degree, your expertise to teach these children, which is pretty sad.
And Patricia, in brief, what was it that you saw as the byproduct of Prop 87?
Well, I thought they tried to shut it down, and then they still had problems because they're stopping programs.
Correct.
Okay?
Correct.
So I don't think that's right. This state has a history of Spanish first, and some of their laws were in Spanish, and they supported the Constitution here in California. Okay? So I guess some people who think it's white only, English only, come here who have no understanding of the history that they're of this country or this part of the world.
So, Patricia,
so they come in here with a big paintbrush and say you can't speak Spanish, okay? You can't do this, you can't do that, and suddenly these people are taken over by the United States. They draw a border, and the only difference is that we are on this side of the border and they're on the other, that the U.S. did, because they took over Mexico and she lost half of her country.
Patricia, I'm going to cut you off, but respectfully. So let me just get, your characterization is that the way you taught bilingually worked, and once it was made illegal, you think that that did a disservice to that community. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much for calling in with that comment.
And you are right, Patricia. I completely agree with you on that.
Okay. You mentioned that there was reforms in 1965 for Asian communities. I think most Americans think 1965, that's when we had the Civil Rights Acts and other things that helped the African American community. And the Asian Acts, were they part of that, or did they just go under the radar because they aren't talked about? We don't see the dog biting, kind of thing.
The Civil Rights Movement, that time, the 60s, it was an exciting time. I think media has really put the spotlight on the African American community, even the Latino community, but somehow the Asians were not part of the Civil Rights Movement, but that's not true. They were actually part of that movement. That was probably the first time where all the different groups actually decided they needed to come together to be empowered because this was an important movement. That's not so much in the media, but if you look back at the history, the Asians actually were part of the Civil Rights Movement.
In the precedent case from Brown was one case here in California, the Mendez case, and that's where I'm telling you that all Asians, Mexicans, and these groups came together to form this multi-ethnic alliance to win this case, the Mendez case, that served as a precedent for the Brown case. So let's not forget that there's a lot of different races, ethnicities that came together, and that's when really we've been able as all together challenge the laws.
Susan, do you think that head start, 1965, versus, say, the Southeast Asian countries that came over in 1975, did that 10 years make a difference?
That's a good question. I think having the refugees here was just a reminder of the war, and so it wasn't helpful for them. The transition, I think, for that particular group was difficult because they didn't have any ethnic enclaves like the other groups. The Vietnamese is larger in population, so they were quick to put something together. So they do have a sizable ethnic town. But the other groups, they were smaller. There's only 200, 300,000 for each group. So I think it was harder for them to band together. But they still, even though we had domestic relations happening here, they had a difficult time still transitioning. And they were also very different from the other groups, and they did not speak English.
How important do you see stability in the home as a contributor to a positive outcome in education?
Well, if you look at all the research, that's what it says, that the home family matters on every account. But life is complicated. There's other contextual factors that we need to take into account. But looking at my own research as an educational psychologist, I look at homes and schools. And so how do they work together? The family, the kid spends 92% of their waking time in the home, and just 8% of that is in the school.
Really?
For the first 18 years of life, yeah.
Wow.
And so the home matters quite a bit. And even the Coleman Report, 1966, it's not so much, he didn't say it was so much the schools that were making the difference, it's what the kids brought to school that made the difference. And it's what social cultural capital, that's, the knowledge, the attitudes, the habits that they're learning at home that makes a difference. Do latchkey kids have a disadvantage? I would say generally yes, because for any home, it's nice to have a parent or an adult there. When you're left to raising yourself, I mean, this is where problems can arise. I mean, there's a lot of latchkey kids here in the United States. And latchkey is simply the term we use to say those whose parents are working out of the house. Right. The kids see themselves when they get home, they see to their chores and such on their own, and they're not guided. Yeah, but of course supervision and that stability is helpful. But that's not to say that kids who don't have that supervision can't succeed. And this is where I think schools can play a role, institutional agents. What I mean by that is teachers, counselors, other adults in the school can play a significant role. For any child to have one adult that cares, that is what the research shows. Any life experience will tell you. It's that one person that can make a difference. Okay, we're out of time. I wanted to hit the next subject, but dang it, we are out of time. It happens every time this week. So
I'd like to thank our guests, Susan Paik and Cecilia Rios-Aguilar, for joining us today. Next week, you won't want to miss it. We're going to look at Native American healing methods that complement our Western medicine. I'm Roger Bowman. Thank you for watching Plugged Inland.